Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today at this press conference. Our speaker today is Mr. Tom Andrews, the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Myanmar. He will brief you today on his latest report to the Human Rights Council. We will begin with opening remarks from the Special Rapporteur, followed by, before moving to questions. Mr. Andrews, you have the floor.
Thank you. Okay, is that good? Yeah, turning it on makes a lot of difference. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for your interest and your attendance. I am very pleased to return to Geneva, where I will have the honor of engaging with the Human Rights Council, along with the High Commissioner and representatives of Myanmar civil society organizations, in an enhanced interactive dialogue on the crisis in Myanmar later this week. Today, I'd like to talk about some of the distressing facts that are emerging out of Myanmar, and I'd also like to address what is even more distressing, the trajectory of these facts and what lies beneath them. And I'd like to circle that trajectory back to the United Nations and its member states, the Human Rights Council, and really to all of us. The facts in Myanmar are dismal. More than 6,800 people have been killed since the coup. More than 22,000 political prisoners are behind bars, most of whom are guilty of only exercising their fundamental rights, including speaking out and participating in demonstrations opposing a brutal military junta. Before the coup, there were 300,000 people internally displaced in Myanmar. Now there are more than 3.5 million. Nearly 1.5 million refugees from Myanmar are currently living in other countries. Nearly a third of the population of Myanmar are facing acute food insecurity. 21.9 million people are in need of humanitarian aid. As if this misery were not enough, a 7.7 magnitude earthquake struck Myanmar on the 28th of March. I was on the Thai-Myanmar border at the time when it struck. We know that at least 3,800 people were killed and more than 5,000 were injured, but the true numbers are likely much, much higher. More than 200,000 were displaced by the earthquake. 3 months after it struck, there are many who continue to sleep on the streets. Hunger or lack of access to water and sanitation facilities haunt many communities. They are forced to grapple with extreme heat, drenching rains, and infectious diseases. Meanwhile, the junta has taken the same approach with earthquake relief that it takes to all humanitarian aid generally: block the delivery of aid to opposition-controlled areas, and attempt to force all donors and agencies to deliver aid only into its own hands. I have spoken with humanitarian workers that have been physically blocked at checkpoints and prevented from delivering aid to earthquake-impacted communities, and experienced their frustration and their anger. The junta has reportedly evicted earthquake survivors from their shelters, leaving those whose homes were destroyed with nowhere to go. The junta proceeded to break a so-called humanitarian ceasefire almost immediately after declaring one, and repeated the same cynical ploy again. Meanwhile, they've been attempting to exact as much legitimacy as possible from engaging with foreign donors, covering the pages of state media with pictures of foreign aid workers posing with junta officials. Let me note, as I have in the past, that the junta needs 3 things to sustain itself: money, weapons, and legitimacy. We need to do more to support the people of Myanmar by denying the junta all 3. And there will be opportunities and an obligation to do so this year by denying any recognition of the junta's so-called election, and I'll put that in quotes, that it is planning for later this year. UN member states should call this exercise for what it is, a charade and a fraud. Now, what is making the deepening crisis in Myanmar worse, for those inside of Myanmar and those who have fled Myanmar, is the dismal, deadly trajectory of the global retreat of international support. The Rohingya in IDP camps in central Rakhine face severe food ration cuts that hit them in April. Now, the World Food Program was able to partially restore these cuts in June, but they're facing the fact that existing resources will not be adequate to meeting a desperate need. Without renewed funding, most of the more than 100,000 refugees in Thailand will not receive any aid starting in August, just a few weeks from now. Food distribution for more than 1 million refugees in Bangladesh will stop in October without additional funding. Health clinics in refugee camps have shut down, leaving patients scrambling to find care or face the consequences of going without treatment. I met many refugees when I was on the border following the earthquake, including persons with disabilities needing medical treatment. I met a 5-year-old boy who needed life-saving heart surgery and his mom. They were among the very lucky ones who were able to get access to life-saving healthcare services that may very soon no longer be available. The fact is, halfway through 2025, the Myanmar Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan is only 12% funded. The Rohingya Humanitarian Crisis Joint Response Plan is only 22% funded. Now, leading the way of this dismal trajectory downward has been the United States. And to be fair, the devastating impact of U.S. cuts reflects in part the leadership role that the United States has historically played in making sure that these vitally important services were adequately funded, at least in the past, and Americans can be proud of that. But the U.S. contribution to the Myanmar Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan was 30% last year. So far, it is 5% this year, 30% to 5%. The U.S. contribution to the Rohingya Humanitarian Crisis Joint Response Plan was 52% in 2024. In 2025, it is 6%. U.S. foreign assistance commitments to Myanmar was $237 million in 2024, $234 million in 2020, $237 million in 2024. It is $8.5 million in 2025. $237 million to $8.5 million. Now, it is fair to ask why other governments had not done more in the past. It's a fair question. And whether they should step up and take a larger share of the burden today. I believe a reasonable answer to the second question is yes. As communities or businesses who are dependent on a large source of revenue, no. It is great as long as these large sources keep up, but devastating when they cut back or worse, cut out. A diversified source of revenue generates stability and security. In the case of those impacted by the crisis in Myanmar, it can indeed be the key to survival. Unfortunately, not only have many governments failed to step up to fill the gaps left by U.S. cuts, many have announced their own reductions in aid. We are going, ladies and gentlemen, in the wrong direction. Of course, the UN Human Rights Council is also being impacted by a retreat in support by UN member states. there has been considerable discussion here in Geneva about what has been described as a liquidity crisis of the Human Rights Council. The fact is, the Human Rights Council liquidity crisis is really a political crisis. It is a leadership crisis. It is a communication crisis. It is a moral crisis. The Human Rights Council shines a spotlight on human rights and assaults on those rights. Its members express sentiments and pass resolutions addressing a wide range of human rights issues. But action as well as words are necessary. Making investments to defend human rights and fund critical aid, establishing funding, adequate funding for these critical budgets is critically important. Action matters. It is critical that governments walk the walk. At issue here, do human rights matter? And if human rights do matter, if human decency matters, if saving the lives of children in Myanmar who are in desperate need of help matter, then those who believe it matters should be willing to invest a modest amount of resources to save lives, stop the immense and growing level of suffering, create stability, and enhance security for all. It is a very, very wise investment. Now, the fact is, there are political forces that are pushing relentlessly to reject the very idea of human rights. We see this all over the globe. And they're pushing to ignore or vilify those who are victimized by brutality, to deny or dismiss the factors that drive desperation, forcing victims out of their homes, out of their villages, or out of their countries, that reject the basic idea that nations can and should work together across national borders to save those whose lives would otherwise be lost. This is who we are at our best. And it is also in our own interest to stand up to forces that drive instability, cruelty, and violence. This is a very dangerous trajectory that we are now on. The fear card, the grievance card, the vilification card are potential political tools and weapons, and they're being used in many areas of the world. But we have seen these cards played before, and we know where their trajectory leads. The United Nations itself was created on the ashes of the devastation that these types of cards generated nearly a century ago. The downward trajectory that we are currently on will continue until leaders are willing to stand up for human rights and set priorities and budgets that reflect the best and not the worst of us. When we do what is necessary to communicate to citizens of all walks of life why this matters. When people of conscience stand up and say, enough is enough. Communication is where you, members of the media, can play a decisive role. The Human Rights Council has been called the conscience of the United Nations. Now, more than ever, the United Nations and world leaders need to hear and heed the voices of conscience, because the stakes could not be higher. I just want to say that there is good news in the fact that we know what happens when action is taken. We can see the results. There's been a 1/3 reduction in the flow of weapons flowing into the hands of the military junta using the international financial system because of actions that have been taken by member states. We know how vital civil society is in Myanmar, and will be some of those representatives of civil society will be addressing the council on Friday. And we know that the private sector has been stepping up as well to take action. When we released the report, a report on why and how the private sector and the public sector have been providing the means by which the junta has been arming itself through the international financial system. Singapore took action that reduced 90% of the weapons flowing from Singapore into Myanmar. And in Thailand, Bangkok Bank cut off its relationship with the junta-controlled Myanmar Economic Bank that facilitates the flow of this financing and translates it into the weapons that are being used to commit gross human rights violations. These are specific actions that are extremely positive and very fruitful. And by the way, these actions don't cost money. They simply require political will. But it is a political will that we need to generate all around the world. The stakes could not be higher. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. The Special Rapporteur will now take questions. Please state your name and organization before asking a question. We'll start with journalists in the room.
Thank you. Nina Larson with AFP. Thanks for this interesting briefing. I was hoping you could provide a few more details about the specific impact on the ground that you're seeing from the cuts to aid. And also, you mentioned the earthquake response. I know that the junta has extended the ceasefire. Is there any sign that things have improved on the ground in terms of the violence, or do you see them continuing airstrikes? If you could just talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good question. We saw just an acceleration of airstrikes in April following the earthquake and following their declaration of a so-called ceasefire. And by the way, that ceasefire that they declared followed the ceasefire that was announced, the unilateral ceasefire announced by resistance forces. So they were kind of shamed into doing something and announcing this ceasefire. But it was a cynical ploy. It meant nothing because, in fact, the actions were extremely devastating. And I talked to doctors. I talked to those who were eyewitnesses of devastated villages that had been hit by these airstrikes. There was someone was telling me that young people were running as they should out of their homes and going out into fields to protect themselves from the earthquake, only to see and hear aircraft above. So they had to turn around and go inside because of that threat. So it was just an extraordinary experience for these, in this case, these young people, but people all over the country. We know, and we've documented, and my reports will continue to document, as I've outlined, the extent to which this devastation continues. But what is important to note is the trend lines, as I've mentioned, are going absolutely in the opposite direction. The junta's attacks on villages have been actually increasing. Air assaults have been increasing, and what we found is that as it's more and more dangerous for ground troops to be moving because of the presence of resistance forces and tactics that have been used to intercept those ground forces or intercept supply lines. The use of aircraft has been increasing, and the use of bombing have been increasing. And the reason that is so devastating is not just the volume, the increase that we've been documenting, but also because of the indiscriminate nature of these aerial attacks and how they have been hitting schools, monasteries. We've documented that they have hit centers for internally displaced persons. I met a dad who lost his two only 2 children, 2 daughters, after he brought them to an IDP center for safety, because the IDP center was hit. I've talked to parents whose children were injured in attacks at a school. So this is devastating, and it's increasing. The numbers are bad, but the reality on the ground, this experience is devastating. And I also just want to put also in kind of brackets, there's a lot we don't know. It's very difficult, as I'm sure you know, of getting information quickly and accurately. Now, we have people around the country that have been very courageous in providing us with information and testimony. But they take great risk in order to do that. And we know that the numbers that we're seeing are less than what is actually happening because of that fact.
Yes. Sorry, just on the people you mentioned now who are taking great risks to get you information. How are you? I mean, the impact that you were talking about, this liquidity crisis at the Human Rights Council, and the fact that things seem to be. I assume that money is in short supply when it comes to these investigations now, and I guess there's a bit of uncertainty about how much you can continue the work and how much effect it might have with everything, with the liquidity crisis. How do you talk to the people on the ground who are providing you with this information at great risk to themselves in light of the developments that you're seeing? Sorry.
No, it's really hard. It's really hard. I mean, they're risking everything, and they've lost so much. And the fact is that we manifest values in action, including budgets. How much money we put up to do things reflects our values. And the message that we're sending in terms of those values is not a good one. That we're not valuing these human lives, these people who's taking such risk to save their country. We're sending them absolutely the wrong message. And the insane thing is that it doesn't take a lot of money. And when you compare the cost of the devastation that's out there and the great risk of the instability and insecurity that can follow, I mean, it's not I think an accident that as these commitments of resources for things like human rights and humanitarian aid have been decreasing, defense budgets have been increasing. So you're creating a world that is much less secure and much less stable. You're fueling it by not making your commitments to things that can actually reduce that instability, and then you're forced to spend even more money on weapons of war to confront this insecurity and instability. And we've seen this movie before. I mean, this very institution was created on the ashes of the devastation of what can happen when these forces are allowed to take off. And they're taking off right now. We can see it happening right now. And I get it. I was in politics for a dozen years in the U.S. And when you're traveling and you're talking to citizens, it's not the easiest case in the world to make we need to send and invest money overseas. But we have to make that case, and we have to and really if the people of my former congressional district met the little boy whose heart condition, surgery was going to determine life or death. They'd want that boy to have that surgery. They'd want these families to be able to survive. They'd understand completely what happens when you've lost everything. And the only hope is to gather your family together and move to safety. They'd understand this. But we need to communicate that to people. And we need to counter this political movement, this vilification, this fear card, these forces of darkness that are descending in areas around the world. We need to fight that. We need to stand up for these principles and values. The member states of the United Nations and the Human Rights Council can only do as much as the political climate in their countries are going to allow. And so leaders have to step up to influence that climate. Civil society has to step up. Faith-based organizations have to step up. We all have to step up to address that climate, and we're not doing it. We're not doing it. So I have the honor of being on the front lines of what's happening, what the consequences of this is, and I'm doing my best to convey that to people. But we all have to take the action necessary to mitigate that immense suffering that I'm witnessing.
There might be other people. To follow up on what you were just saying,
Yes.
Right, today there's a big NATO meeting where countries are getting together to discuss, as you were mentioning, defense budgets. And these are some of the same countries that have slashed their funding for humanitarian aid and foreign aid. If you could just say something about this push to increase defense budgets to 5% that they're discussing today.
We need to be addressing the causes of instability and insecurity, and we're failing to do that. And so it is a much wiser investment, and it is a much more reasonable investment to mitigate the causes of instability and security, rather than be putting more and more money into dealing with the consequences of that insecurity and instability. It's an imbalance here that's going on. It's these trajectories of defense spending going this way and human rights and humanitarian spending going in absolutely the opposite direction. This leads to disaster. And that's the trajectory that we are on. That is why this is so dangerous. The conversations in NATO, I know, are not going to include what I'm talking about, but they should. They really, really should.
Thank you. Now we'll take the questions from those online.
Thank you very much. Okay, so the reduction of U.S. aid you have mentioned is very dramatic. Would you dare to say that U.S. has abandoned the Rohingya people and also other opposition in Myanmar, also by banning the entry of Myanmar citizens to the USA? And also, if I may, I think you mentioned in other reports or other interventions that Myanmar junta was losing ground. I don't think you haven't mentioned now. Does it mean that is regaining control, and what this would mean for the future of Myanmar and the possibility of the democracy coming back to the country? Thank you.
Well, I can tell you that the United States is not alone in moving in the wrong direction when it comes to humanitarian aid and supporting democracy and human rights in Myanmar. Other countries are following suit. But my point was that the United States, having been such a leader in investments in humanitarian aid and human rights, the dramatic cuts that have been made by the United States is that much more devastating. So the impact is that much more devastating because of the volume that we started out with U.S. funding. So you need to put that in context, and I think it's fair for the United States to say, well, look, we've been providing the world with a greater share than what we should be. They should be more balanced. Other countries should be stepping up. It's a fair argument, and we can have that discussion. But the fact is that we're all going in the wrong direction. And instead of stepping up, countries are stepping back. And of course, the United States, we just talked about NATO, has been pressuring NATO countries to step up when it comes to defense spending. Well, I think it's really important that NATO countries and all countries step up when it comes to humanitarian aid and investments in human rights. And what made it all the worse is not just the volume of, you go from the very, very significant, the $237 million from the United States in 2024 down to 8.5 million. That is devastating. But what is made that worse is because it happened so abruptly and so chaotically. And people couldn't prepare. They couldn't make adjustments. They couldn't look to see where other resources might come from. So it was the cuts and the chaos around those cuts that made things so devastating. I mean, I was there when that earthquake happened, and I was there as the mobilization of support and aid to desperate people was underway. And the United States was missing in action when in the past it would be taking a lead in not only providing resources, but coordinating the provision of resources. And it broke my heart to see that expertise on the ground there, ready to go, and not being used because of the chaos that followed those devastating cuts. So it was the amount, and it was the chaos, and the stakes of that were quite devastating. Oh, and the second part of the question was with respect to the resistance and the progress that has been made on the ground. I don't want to. I want to be really clear here. There is. I think it's very difficult to predict anything. Of course, the case in Syria is a good example. Who would have thought that change happened as dramatically as it did? But the fact is that the military junta, while it is loathed by the people of Myanmar, believe me, and while it has lost considerable, it's lost territory and it's lost soldiers and military facilities and so forth. There's no question at all. It's the reason why they have this forced military conscription program. They're losing. They're losing ground literally and figuratively, but they have significant resources available to them, financial resources and weapons that are being provided to them from abroad. And as long as those resources continue to flow, they're going to continue to wreak significant havoc, and they're not hesitant to do so.
Thank you. We have a follow-up question online.
Thank you for your answers. Just another short question. In the beginning, you mentioned very interesting numbers, including the number of dead in the conflict, which sometimes is difficult to get these numbers. Do they come from your own investigation, or you have official sources? For example, these 63,000 people that you mentioned that have died since the coup. Thank you.
Yeah, no, these come from a variety of sources, but they're vetted sources. They're very reliable and they're understated if anything. I mean, this is when I mention these numbers, there are at least these numbers of people, and you get a range. I mean, some come out with higher numbers than these, but these are vetted numbers. But 6,800 people killed, 22,000 political prisoners behind bars, and just think about that, and the fact that they're declaring there's going to be an election. in the end of the year. And they're looking for basically, they want to find an exit ramp to the international pressure. They're trying to create this mirage of an election exercise that will create a legitimate civilian government. But, you cannot have an election when you imprison and torture and execute your opponents, when it is illegal to report the truth as a journalist, when it's illegal to speak out and criticize the junta. And it's really important that countries reject this idea of an election and not allow the military junta to attempt to get away with this fraud. I mean, that doesn't cost any money to do so, but it would be extremely helpful if the UN member states were to make it very clear that that this is going to be recognized not as an election, but as a fraud. That would go a long way.
Thank you. Are there any other questions in the room or online? I see a hand up online. Is it an old hand or is there a question?
No, I have a question if nobody else wants to ask. It's about the weapons. You mentioned that countries like Thailand and Singapore have been able to reduce. It looks like these countries are more channels, no, that rather than providers of weapons. Do you know, or can you mention which countries, which governments could be selling weapons to the junta? Thank you.
Well, yes, I've documented these, and we continue to monitor the traffic flow, and some of those numbers, have changed and modified over the past few years. But what has been remaining pretty consistent is that Russia is the single largest source of weapons for the military junta, and China is the second largest source of weapons for the military junta.
Thank you. Is there another question in the room or online? Thank you. If there are no further questions, we will now close this press conference. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Mr. Andrews.
Thank you.